She walked into the building hoping for a chance, a simple job, a fresh start. What she got instead was laughter, condescension, and humiliation before she could even introduce herself. But what the smug receptionist and polished hiring manager didn't know was this: the woman they mocked wasn't just a job applicant. She was married to the man who signed their paychecks. And the cameras had caught everything. When she walked back in the next morning, on the arm of the CEO, their careers weren't the only things about to be destroyed. How do you apologize to someone whose silence just cost you everything? It was a rainy Tuesday morning when Eleanor Hart stepped into the gleaming lobby of Kendall and Slate Incorporated. Her shoes, though clean, were not the glossy heels expected in a place like this. Her coat, a second-hand wool blend, hung unevenly around her petite frame. And her hair, tied in a simple bun, looked more practical than professional. Yet behind the modest appearance was a woman of sharp intellect and an education few could rival. As she walked toward the reception desk, she felt the quiet prickle of gazes, the kind that measure a person not by their resume, but by the label on their coat. She gave her name with quiet confidence: Eleanor Hart, here for the 10 a.m. interview for the position of Team Operations Manager. The receptionist, a young woman with perfectly sculpted nails and a raised eyebrow, gave Eleanor a once-over so quick it almost stung. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" she asked, without hiding the smirk. Before Eleanor could respond, 2 junior associates nearby chuckled. "Maybe she's here to apply for janitorial," one whispered, loud enough to be heard. A third chimed in, "These walk-ins are getting bolder." The receptionist leaned in slightly and lowered her voice as if she were doing Eleanor a favor. "Sweetheart, this is Kendall and Slate. We don't accept applications without HR approval. You're probably looking for the staffing agency across the street." Eleanor opened her mouth to explain, but the woman raised a hand. "We really don't have time today. Our executives are very busy." Moments later, 2 security guards, apologetic but firm, escorted Eleanor back out the revolving doors without a single manager ever knowing she was there. Outside, the rain hadn't let up. She stood on the sidewalk for a few seconds, soaked not from the weather, but from disbelief. She hadn't been given a moment to speak. No one had even glanced at her resume. She was deemed unworthy the second she stepped through the doors, and it wasn't just discourteous. It was systemic. Behind the reception desk, the staff resumed their laughter. They thought they had handled a nuisance, an outsider. What they didn't realize was that the woman they had thrown out was not only qualified, she was married to the man who owned the very building they worked in. The CEO. And this wasn't just a chance encounter. It was a test. She didn't rush to call her husband. She didn't cry. Instead, she stood for a few more moments under the rain, took a deep breath, and walked away, not in defeat, but in quiet resolution. Inside, the front desk remained smugly unaware of the storm brewing just beyond the glass doors. A storm that would blow through their world faster than any of them could have imagined. The footage was already on its way to someone who would care a lot more than they expected. And the next time Eleanor walked through those doors, she wouldn't be standing alone. Back at home, Eleanor dried her hair in silence, the soft hum of the old dryer blending with the ticking clock on the kitchen wall. Her home wasn't extravagant. It wasn't even large by most standards. The wooden floors creaked slightly underfoot, and the furniture, though clean and well kept, was mismatched from years of thrift store browsing and spontaneous charm. A lemon pie cooled on the windowsill, and 2 dogs dozed lazily on the living room rug. This was her sanctuary, a place where luxury was measured not in marble countertops or imported chandeliers but in the aroma of baked goods, hand-sewn curtains, and the comfort of worn-in books stacked lovingly by the fireplace. It was a deliberate life, simple by choice, one where status had no power and humility reigned. Yet within these unassuming walls lived the wife of Miles Hart, CEO of Kendall and Slate, one of the most profitable private firms in the country. Miles, by contrast, operated in a different world. His name rarely appeared in press photos. He didn't do interviews. He ran his empire from the shadows, preferring boardrooms with frosted glass and midnight emails to grand gestures and red carpets. When he and Eleanor married nearly a decade ago, he knew she came from a different cloth, woven not in silk but in substance. She had turned down the mansion he wanted to buy for them, vetoed every limo that tried to wait at the curb, and refused any designer label offered as a gift. She wasn't trying to make a point. She simply didn't see herself above others and found comfort in being treated like everyone else. It was how she had grown up, her father a schoolteacher, her mother a nurse, both insisting that integrity meant more than income. And she carried those values into every room she walked into, even when others failed to see the woman behind the cardigan and canvas tote. Despite being married to one of the most powerful men in the state, Eleanor never used her last name to open doors. In fact, she often went by her maiden name, Daniels, when applying for things on her own. Miles respected that, admired it, even. But in recent months, she had grown quietly uneasy. Over dinner one evening, she confided in him that she'd overheard a conversation between two former interns, now full-time staff, during a corporate picnic. They laughed as they spoke of how they screened undesirables who showed up uninvited, boasting about how they could tell who belonged based on wardrobe alone. Eleanor's eyes had darkened at the memory. "I'm not accusing," she'd said, "but I wonder if it's a one-time thing, or if your company's culture is shifting." That planted a seed. Miles didn't dismiss her concerns. In fact, he took them very seriously. A man used to dealing in data and results, he quietly commissioned a full internal audit on company culture, but Eleanor went further. "Let me see for myself," she proposed. "No cameras. No titles. Just me, walking in like anyone else." He hesitated at first, worried about the emotional cost it might bring, but ultimately agreed. It wasn't just a social experiment. It was personal. Eleanor wanted to know whether kindness still had a place at the table, whether the people in his company treated everyone with dignity or only those they deemed important. What she didn't expect was how clearly the answer would arrive. The interview was a test, yes, but it was also a mirror. And what it reflected was uglier than she was prepared to see. As she sat on the porch that evening, the rain now long gone, Eleanor sipped tea and replayed the day's events in her mind. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even bitter. What she felt was something deeper, disappointment, a sorrow that good people could become so hardened by image and hierarchy. Her dogs climbed into her lap, and she smiled faintly, running a hand through one of their thick coats. She didn't need validation. She had lived an entire life knowing who she was. But now she had proof, undeniable, recorded proof, of what the company had become when the boss wasn't watching. And while she hadn't told Miles the full details yet, she knew it would devastate him. Not because of the insult to her, but because he had always tried to build something better. Inside, the pie had cooled, and the house smelled like lemon and sugar and cracked vanilla beans. It was peaceful. But something was shifting beneath the stillness. Eleanor wasn't a woman who sought revenge, but she believed in consequences. And while she wouldn't demand any herself, she knew the truth would not remain buried for long. Tomorrow would bring a reckoning, not just for those who laughed her out the door, but for everyone in the company who had forgotten that humility, not hierarchy, was supposed to define their brand. Quiet as she was, Eleanor had shaken an empire. And the ripples were only beginning. The morning after her failed interview, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad, a red pen, and a bowl of overripe plums. She wasn't the type to dwell in outrage, but something about how easily she'd been dismissed kept looping in her mind, like a film reel stuck on a single, degrading frame. She wrote down every moment in vivid detail, not because she needed to remember, but because she needed a record. The way the receptionist sneered without hesitation. The laughter from the associates. The fact that no one asked a single question before deciding who she was. It wasn't just unprofessional. It was systemic. And Eleanor, as much as she hated admitting it, was the perfect person to test it. She had access to every angle, internal, personal, and legal. But more importantly, she had perspective. She understood what it meant to live unseen. And now, she also understood how dangerous unchecked arrogance could be when no one holds the mirror up. Later that day, Miles came home earlier than usual, his shirt sleeves rolled up and his tie forgotten in the car. Eleanor waited until he sat down, then slid the legal pad across the table. He read in silence, his jaw tightening with each line. When he looked up, there wasn't rage in his eyes, there was heartbreak. "They did this to you?" he asked, voice hushed like someone mourning something sacred. She nodded once. Miles leaned back, his mind spinning. He had trusted his team, believed that his emphasis on integrity and meritocracy had woven itself into the company's very DNA. But what Eleanor had exposed was rot, not visible on paper, not reflected in quarterly numbers, but moral decay that spread in whispers, in laughter behind closed doors, in the quiet dismissal of those who didn't wear the right shoes or carry the right bag. It was clear now that somewhere along the line, the company's culture had stopped mirroring its founding principles and started reflecting the worst parts of corporate elitism. Eleanor didn't want vengeance. She wanted understanding. She wanted the people at that desk to see her again, not as someone connected to power, but as a human being worthy of basic decency. But she also knew that reflection wasn't enough. Behavior didn't change without accountability. Miles, recognizing this, took a deep breath and told her something she didn't expect. She wasn't the only person who'd ever been part of an undercover culture test. Months prior, after hearing other subtle red flags, he had launched an initiative to test internal ethics by hiring anonymous auditors, elderly applicants, disabled actors, and individuals with unpolished resumes, to gauge how staff handled non-traditional candidates. The results had been inconclusive. Some departments passed with flying colors. Others, not so much. But never had he expected the data to be so stark until the day his own wife, unknowingly, had become the final and most undeniable audit. But now they had something better than written reports or hearsay. They had truth caught in action. Eleanor hadn't gone in with a recording device, but the company had its own: security footage, elevator logs, and lobby cameras, all centralized in a system Miles had full access to. That evening, as Eleanor prepared dinner, Miles pored through time-stamped footage, locating the exact moment she'd stepped into the building. With a sick feeling in his gut, he watched as his staff dismissed, ridiculed, and laughed at his wife, each frame a betrayal, each minute a revelation. It wasn't just the receptionist. It was a culture of mimicry, junior staff copying bad behavior to gain favor, supervisors looking the other way, and the subtle cues that told everyone it was okay to judge at first glance. He clicked export and saved the footage to a private drive labeled, Audit, Eleanor. By the end of the night, a plan was already forming in his mind. He didn't want a spectacle, but neither could he allow this to be swept under the rug. He began drafting an emergency internal review and scheduled a mandatory staff meeting for the following week. Eleanor watched him work with quiet respect, knowing this wasn't just about her. It was about resetting a moral compass that had drifted so far off course it no longer pointed north. They didn't talk much over the next few hours. She brought him a cup of tea. He nodded in thanks and kept typing. For all their differences in demeanor, both were anchored by the same principle. People should be treated with dignity regardless of what they wear, what they earn, or who they know. Later, as the moon rose over the modest house they'd chosen over the mansion, Eleanor stood at the sink washing dishes. Her reflection in the window looked back at her, not defeated, not vindictive, but resolved. She hadn't set out to expose anyone. But now that the curtain had been pulled back, there was no closing it again. The company her husband had built from the ground up was about to face a reckoning. Not because the numbers were wrong, but because the people were. And she had unknowingly become the storm that would wash the dirt from its gleaming glass tower. The day after Miles labeled the footage and began outlining the staff meeting agenda, he reached out to his chief of internal security with a simple directive: compile all relevant camera feeds from the past 72 hours, lobby and floor 1 only, priority code 11. No explanation. No added context. But the code spoke volumes. Everyone in corporate security knew that code 11 meant the audit project was active again. A silent shiver passed through the department. It had been nearly a year since they were told to monitor employee interactions under the guise of cultural safety drills. But now, it wasn't a test subject or an actor. It was someone personal. What Eleanor didn't know, what very few knew, was that long before she'd walked through the doors for that fateful interview, Miles had already begun building quiet infrastructure to reveal the truth about his company from within. What started as a social experiment had become something much more sophisticated. A system of silent accountability. It began 2 years ago after a well-qualified applicant with a stutter filed a complaint alleging he'd been dismissed unfairly before he could even introduce himself. There had been no hard evidence then, just his word against a polished recruiter's, but the incident had never sat well with Miles. It wasn't enough to release statements about inclusivity. If Kendall and Slate was going to claim ethical superiority, they needed proof, not platitudes. So, he initiated Project Mirror. Strategically placed high-res cameras were installed, not to watch for theft or unauthorized access, but to monitor tone, treatment, and trust. Only a select group of compliance officers knew what to look for, not just what was said, but how it was said. Who smiled at which guest? Who ignored the janitor? Who made space in the elevator for someone carrying coffee? It was subtle, but it was powerful. And it all funneled back to one encrypted hub that only Miles and his core team could access. As of this week, Eleanor's mistreatment was now the most damning footage they had ever collected. By Thursday, the internal files were complete. There were 7 different angles showing Eleanor's arrival, her polite greeting, the condescending gestures, and the deliberate dismissal. More than the words, it was the tone and body language that painted the clearest picture of how deeply rooted the problem had become. The receptionist, who appeared so polished on paper, openly sneered with impunity. The young associates didn't hesitate to mock someone they assumed had no leverage. One even rolled his eyes and mimed a cleaning gesture with a smirk, as if preemptively demoting her in his mind. What none of them knew was that one of the wall-mounted digital art panels wasn't just decorative, it was a facial recognition device, silently tracking employee interactions as part of a long-running behavioral analytics project. That data, now cross-referenced with the video, showed that the receptionist had a 94% favorability rating when dealing with senior staff, and a 12% rate with visitors not wearing formal attire. The evidence was no longer anecdotal. It was algorithmic. Miles spent hours combing through the footage alone, headphones on, pausing every few seconds, watching as the subtle cruelties unfolded. He recognized each staff member by name. Some had been hired personally. One had even been at his wedding. It was a betrayal not just of Eleanor, but of the values he thought he had embedded in the company's DNA. At one point, he closed his laptop and simply sat in silence, head in his hands. How had he failed to see it growing right under his nose? These weren't bad people, necessarily. But the environment had taught them that surface mattered more than substance. That unless you looked the part, you didn't deserve a seat at the table. And now that truth had been caught, frame by frame, second by second. By Friday morning, Miles had rewritten the meeting agenda 4 times. He didn't want a performance. He wanted reflection. So, he made a final call to the company's legal counsel and informed them of what had happened. Not because he feared lawsuits, but because he knew what was coming next could ripple far beyond one lobby encounter. The company had to brace itself for a reckoning. And Eleanor. She remained composed, as always, carrying on with her errands, dropping off cookies at the local shelter, walking the dogs, acting as if nothing in the world had shifted. But Miles knew better. Her silence wasn't indifference. It was restraint. And in that restraint was more power than any speech he could deliver. That night, he sat across from her and said quietly, "We're ready. Monday morning. 9 a.m. They'll all be there." She nodded once, not asking for details. She didn't want revenge. But she did want the truth to stand up and be seen. And in just 3 days, an entire building of confident professionals would finally learn that they hadn't just been seen, they'd been studied, recorded, and measured. The irony was bitter. For years, Kendall and Slate had branded itself as the most human company in the room. But now, it was a humble woman in a borrowed blazer who would teach them what humanity truly looked like. Monday morning dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the storm quietly brewing inside the mirrored walls of Kendall and Slate's headquarters. At 8:45 a.m., the building buzzed with its usual pre-meeting routine. Hurried coffees, whispered updates in elevators, the click of heels on marble floors. The staff, oblivious to what was coming, filtered into the main auditorium as instructed, unaware that their day was about to implode. Some joked about another motivational speech. Others exchanged glances, sensing something different in the air, an odd tension, a kind of anticipatory silence not even the hum of projectors or clink of pens could break. Then, at precisely 9 a.m., the doors at the back of the room swung open, and the room collectively froze. Miles' heart stepped in, not with his usual assistant or presentation materials, but with Eleanor beside him, dressed in the same plain clothes she'd worn to the interview. No makeup. No heels. No labels. Just truth, wrapped in quiet grace. Whispers surged like a current across the room as recognition dawned. Some staff sat bolt upright. Others instinctively shrank back. The receptionist, seated toward the front, paled visibly, her posture stiffening as if expecting a guillotine to drop. Eleanor's expression gave nothing away. She didn't look vengeful or smug, just calm, almost gentle, the way a storm feels in the moments before it rips the roof off. Miles took to the podium with no opening joke, no pleasantries. He scanned the room slowly, making deliberate eye contact with department heads, junior staff, and interns alike. "What happened in this building last week," he began, "was unacceptable, not just to me as your CEO, but to me as a human being. And I need you to see it. Not through your own words or assumptions, but through the lens of unfiltered truth." The lights dimmed. A video screen descended from the ceiling. And then it played. No narration. No commentary. Just raw footage from lobby cameras. Eleanor entering. Her name spoken. Her posture respectful. The mocking glances. The turned backs. The smirks. The laughter. The subtle, sharp body language. The ejection. The smug return to normalcy. The silence in the room became suffocating. People stared at the screen as if watching their own funerals unfold. The receptionist looked physically ill. One junior associate buried his face in his hands. When the video ended, Miles didn't speak immediately. He let the discomfort settle, allowed the silence to drag like a blade across the air. Then he said quietly, "You've all seen the woman beside me dozens of times. Not because she flaunts who she is, but because she never felt the need to. Eleanor Hart. My wife. But more importantly, your test." Gasps broke the tension, followed by stunned silence. Then came the shame. Visible, raw, and impossible to hide. The very people who had dismissed her now sat frozen, the weight of their assumptions collapsing in on them like imploding glass. "I didn't ask her to do this," Miles continued. "She volunteered because she sensed something I didn't. That we were becoming the very kind of company we swore we'd never be. One that judges worth by image. One that forgets dignity in the face of appearances. One that confuses polish with potential. And she was right." He didn't yell. He didn't need to. His disappointment was louder than any scream. He announced immediate terminations, starting with the receptionist and the two associates whose behavior was deemed most egregious. Others would be subject to ethics reviews and mandatory retraining. The HR director was suspended pending further investigation. The auditorium was silent, not from shock, but from the eerie awareness that this wasn't just punishment, it was a reckoning. But what happened next was what truly shattered expectations. Miles stepped aside, and Eleanor took the microphone. She didn't have a speech. She didn't need one. Her voice, soft but unwavering, cut through the room like a slow-moving earthquake. "I didn't come here today to humiliate anyone," she began. "I came because I believe people deserve the chance to become better once they've been shown who they've become." She described her experience not with anger, but with detail, how quickly she had been erased, how easily laughter replaced listening. She didn't call names. She didn't assign blame beyond what had already been witnessed. But what she offered instead was more haunting. She offered forgiveness. Not absolution, but the opportunity for reflection. "The worst thing you can do," she said quietly, "is walk out of this room and think this was about me. This was about how you treat anyone who isn't useful to you." People wept. Others sat stone still, guilt leaking from their eyes. Eleanor handed the microphone back and walked to the side of the stage. She had said her piece. The room, filled with hundreds of powerful employees, had just been humbled by one woman in a cotton dress. Miles closed the meeting with one final note. The company would be instituting a sweeping new integrity audit system, placing more power in the hands of support staff to report discrimination, and opening an anonymous feedback channel that went directly to his desk. "Culture is what happens when no one's watching," he said. "But now, we always will be." As they left the stage, Eleanor didn't look back. She didn't need to. The message had landed. The foundation had cracked, and the repair wouldn't be cosmetic. It would be fundamental. The woman they thought was a nobody had just reminded everyone of what it truly meant to be somebody. And in that moment, the halls of Kendall and Slate were no longer filled with ambition and ego, but with the echo of a lesson no one would forget. The week following the meeting was unlike anything Kendall and Slate had ever experienced. Gone were the self-assured struts and careless laughter echoing through the hallways. In their place were lowered voices, reflective glances, and the subtle but undeniable weight of accountability. Every department, from marketing to legal, was tasked with a full internal review of behavioral standards, and Miles personally met with every team leader to re-establish what the company stood for, not in policy documents, but in practice. The staff lounge, once a haven of whispered gossip and social peacocking, had fallen eerily quiet. The receptionist's desk remained unmanned for 3 days, a silent reminder of how quickly titles meant nothing when character failed. Yet despite the unease, something unexpected began to stir beneath the shame: growth. The very public collapse of the office's polished illusion had sparked something far more valuable than fear: introspection. Eleanor, meanwhile, returned to her quiet routines with a kind of grace that bewildered those who had seen her poised but piercing presence on stage. She made no public statements, gave no interviews, and didn't allow the media circus, triggered by anonymous leaks from the company, to drag her into the spotlight. Instead, she continued walking her dogs, volunteering at the community kitchen, and hand-delivering baked goods to the senior center. But something within her had changed. Not hardened, deepened. What she had witnessed, and what she had unwittingly triggered, had revealed how deeply the world needed more empathy disguised as ordinariness. She had never wanted power, but now that she had wielded it, if only for a moment, she felt a responsibility to use it for more than just corporate reckoning. She began outlining a new project, a non-profit initiative dedicated to helping job applicants who face discrimination based on appearance, socioeconomic background, or perceived lack of fit. She would call it the Second Glance Foundation. The foundation's mission was simple: to give dignity a seat at the table. Eleanor envisioned it as a network of career mentors, resume workshops, and a reporting platform for discriminatory hiring practices. She reached out to a few of the very HR representatives and executives who had been shaken by the recent events at Kendall and Slate, and to her surprise, many said yes. Quietly, humbly. Some offered office space. Others offered anonymous funding. One even resigned from his corporate position entirely to join the foundation full-time. The ripple effects were real, reaching beyond the walls of one company and into the broader business community. News outlets began reporting on corporate elitism with new urgency, and Eleanor, while remaining anonymous in most stories, became a kind of urban legend in HR circles, a symbol of the risk of judging too quickly and the power of quiet justice. Back at Kendall and Slate, the culture began to shift, not overnight, but undeniably. New hires were vetted not only for skill, but for humility and emotional intelligence. Senior staff were required to complete empathy-based leadership training. And perhaps most importantly, internal promotions now considered peer-based evaluations, not just performance metrics. The phrase mirror check became shorthand in meetings, a term employees used to remind each other to reflect on their tone, body language, and unconscious biases before making decisions. Even the company's slogan changed. The branding team, once obsessed with sleek slogans, now adopted something far more grounded: see the person, not the polish. It was a small change, but one that symbolized a much larger evolution. Miles, ever the strategist, chose not to speak publicly about what had happened. He declined all interview requests, released a short statement thanking his staff for their resilience, and refocused entirely on internal healing. But he knew, deep down, that none of it would have been possible without Eleanor. Not just because she'd been the target, but because she'd chosen to forgive. That choice, more than the footage or firings or reforms, had become the cornerstone of the company's rebirth. And while others might have relished the vindication, Eleanor didn't frame what happened as a triumph. To her, it was a moment of necessary rupture, a painful but essential tearing down of illusion to let the truth breathe again. Not everything could be fixed. Not everyone would learn. But enough had changed to make the ordeal worth it. One evening, a month after the meeting, Eleanor and Miles sat on their back porch under a sky swollen with stars. He leaned back with a glass of wine, and she sipped chamomile tea from her favorite chipped mug. He turned to her, a smile in his eyes. "You changed the entire company without even raising your voice." She chuckled softly. Maybe they just needed to listen to a woman in flats instead of Ferragamos. They laughed together, the kind of deep, tired laughter that only comes after walking through fire and making it out the other side. Then came the quiet again, the comforting kind. The kind that tells you no more needs to be said. But what lingered, long after the headlines faded and the HR manuals were rewritten, was the question Eleanor had left the staff with on that stage. Not about her identity, or her husband, or even the company, but about every single person they'd ever overlooked. How many people have you judged before they spoke? The question hung like a quiet bell over every future interaction at Kendall and Slate. And even for those who left, it traveled with them, into new jobs, new lives, and new conversations. That was Eleanor's legacy. Not revenge. Not scandal. But reflection. The kind that doesn't scream, but echoes forever.